Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with another episode of Cheap Shots. This series is dedicated to showing you money-saving tips on your wargaming hobby, and on today's episode we're going to show you guys how to quickly and cheaply paint up Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. We'll be looking at one of the explorers, and that character is Janus Draik. Janus Draik is actually a very interesting character with a beautiful sculpt. He's available from the starter box set from Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. This miniature is really cool with a lot of character, really a lot of unique characteristics about it. And we're using this miniature in our games of Necromunda on this channel. Now, as you can see here, this will be the end result that you will have with a beautiful tabletop standards, as long as you follow the tips, techniques, as well as materials that we suggest in order to paint it this way with our Cheapskate method. So, assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time with our Cheapskate method, you're looking at a grand total investment of $28.47 on our paint up your miniature to look just like this. And when you compare this from the materials that you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel from Games Workshop, you're talking about a grand total savings of $141.43. So with that being said, let's go on and talk about how to quickly and cheaply paint up Janus Draik from Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. So the first thing you need to do, of course, is to assemble the miniature. They're actually very quick and easy to actually put together from the Warhammer Quest line. A lot of the miniatures are actually push-fit miniatures, so you don't really need to use any glue or anything like that in order to assemble this guy. And once you have your miniature fully assembled, the next thing, of course, you need to do is to texture the base. Now, you could, of course, buy a pot of astrogranite from Citadel. It's a texture paint. It costs $7.80. Or you could do what I recommend, which is using sand as well as wood glue. What I do is I take wood glue and I paint directly on top of the base where I want the texturing to be at, and then I dust it with sand that I get from my backyard and my garden. It's just not modeling sand, just regular sand I get from the outside. Once that dries, what I then do is make a slurry using a half and half mixture of both wood glue as well as water. I mix both of those together to almost where it's the consistency of milk, and then I paint it like a wash all over the texturing on top of the base. When it dries, it creates an airtight seal that keeps the texturing from flaking off the base. Now, once you're done with that, the last thing you do, of course, is to prime your miniature. You could, of course, use Corax White Spray from Citadel. That costs $17, but I prefer using Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. That costs $3.99 at my local Walmart. And all you're going to do is just give the quick once-over real fast with the priming. Now, unfortunately, these miniatures from the Warhammer Quest box set for Blackstone Fortress have this bright red plastic that they use in order to create these guys, so that is a little bit of a pain, so a little bit more of that red will come through, but that's perfectly fine. All you got to do is hit it with the white primer, and you're ready to go. Now, priming actually does a very important step for your miniature painting, and the reason why it does that is because it gives a textured surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. If you're to paint your miniature using acrylic paints and just paint the bare plastic without any primer, the surface tension would not be enough to keep the acrylic paint on it, and any type of friction at all would cause it to rub away and destroy the finish on your miniature. So you want to also make sure that you use a primer to do so. Now, when it comes to colors of primers, it pretty much depends on the vibrancy of the colors that you're going for. Traditionally speaking, a white primer is best for bright or very strong colors that are really bright and colorful, like yellows and greens and that kind of thing. Darker primers such as black is really good for darker color schemes like dark purples and blues, and of course gray is just a nice natural medium. Since we're using a quick paint method on this with an oil wash, I want to keep my colors quite vibrant and bright, so because of that, with a white primer on this. Now, of course, the first thing we do now is start painting up the miniature. So for Janus Draik, he's actually got a very flamboyant and very colorful color scheme because he is a rogue trader and he dresses to match that part. So for this character, what I decided to use was two colors. I used Skyline by Folk Art, but I get this in my local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. The opposite to this from Games Workshop would be Rust Gray, which costs $4.55. I just put two thin layers directly onto his trousers. And as for his shirt, I actually paint that in bright magenta that I get that from Apple Barrel Paint from my local Walmart. It costs about 50 cents. The corresponding color from Citadel would be Screamer Pink, which costs $4.55 instead. So what I do is put two thin layers of those directly onto his clothing, and it's a nice, vibrant, also kind of contrasts nicely and kind of adds overall to his aristocratic look that this character is going for. From there, the next color we're going to focus on next is on his boots. Now, from Games Workshop, you could purchase Eshin Gray, which costs $4.55. However, the cheaper alternative would be using Apple Barrel's Pavement, which costs 50 cents at your local Walmart. I just put two thin coats of this directly onto the black leather of his boots. Now, Pavement is actually not a black color. It appears black on this photo, but in actuality, it's the super dark gray. It is almost black, but the reason why I love using this Pavement paint is because there is a little bit of texturing to it, little grainy texturals to it, and when you actually dry brush it with gray and lighter shades of gray, it does a beautiful job with the dry brushing, and that's exactly what I want to go for this miniature. I use Pavement paint almost everything that I use for black. Just put two thin coats on it, and you're ready to move on. Now, the next detail we're going to work on next on this miniature is on the flesh. Now, luckily for us, there's not much flesh on this character that is being exposed, just his hands and his face for the most part. So what you could do is, of course, you could use Citadel's Cadian Flesh Tone that costs $4.55. However, I prefer using Flesh by Apple Barrel Paint. It's 9 times cheaper than the Cadian Flesh Tone and does exactly the same thing. I just put 2 thin coats all over his face as well as his hands. You don't need to be particularly neat on this part. Just make sure that you don't get this directly onto the magenta or onto the magenta of the shirt. But if you do, you just go back and touch up real quick, and it's really easy. So after we get done with that, the next thing you do, of course, is a dry brush. Now, dry brushing is a really important step to use on miniatures because what it does, it creates the illusion of depth in your miniature. When you actually dry brush your miniature, what ends up happening is that the individual pigments of the paint adhere to the raised surfaces of the miniature, and it leaves that darker base coat in the recesses of the miniature, creating highlights and that illusion of depth. Now, if you do notice on this one, the miniature does have a little bit of a chalky appearance, and the reason why is because that is a side effect of dry brushing. But do not worry, if that chalky pastel appearance and texture bothers you, just be aware that when we do the oil wash, that oil wash is going to smooth out those transitions and makes a much more natural look, and that chalkiness will go away. Now, when you do the dry brushing on this miniature, you could of course use Games Workshop's Flayed One Flesh, which costs $4.55. However, I use Delta Cerancoat's Peaches and Cream, which costs us 65 cents, which is like almost 8 times less than the actual price. So that was the color I prefer to use for my miniature as well. And once you get done dry brushing the flesh, we can move on to our next details. So the next major detail we're going to work on now is the great overcoat that this character actually wears. Now, with this color, I use True Blue by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. I just put 2 thin coats on all the sleeves as well as the main body of the great coat that this guy is wearing as well. Now, the color that you could use from Citadel in order to match this color would be McCrag Blue. That costs $4.55. Way more expensive than my cheap True Blue, but as you can see, it does exactly the same thing. It's a beautiful, vibrant blue color that is just perfectly matches the midtones we're looking for this. Just put 2 thin coats of this blue paint on, and then we're ready to move on to our dry brush. Now for this next step, we're going to dry brush the trousers as well as the boots as well as the blue overcoat that this character is wearing as well. Now if you wanted to, you could of course use Fenrisian Gray by Citadel Paints. That costs $4.55, a nice sky blue, kind of sky blue grayish color. But I like using Anita's acrylic slate blue. It costs only 65 cents, significantly cheaper than Fenrisian Gray, and it does exactly the same result. I just do a quick once over real fast with the dry brushing on the trousers, the boots, as well as the jacket to create the capture the folds and the details of that, and also add a little bit of a highlight to it as well. So with most of the miniature painted, we can now start focusing on the finer details. For example, that epic mustache, as well as kind of a side cut that this guy is rocking for his hair as well. Kind of looks like that same kind of haircut that Brad Pitt was rocking in the movie Fury, that World War II movie. For that color, of course, you will use a gray in order to create that, to make that look, to make him look more distinguished as well as older. In this situation, what you could end up using is Slanesh Gray by Citadel if you want to, but that costs $4.55, whereas Pewter Gray from Apple Barrel Paint does exactly the same thing and is 9 times cheaper. Not to mention you also get 2 fluid ounces of this stuff, which is also awesome as well. Just put 2 thin layers along the hair as well as the mustache of this epic looking character, and then we can move on to our next fine detail. And the next detail we'll be focusing is the red color. In this case, we'll be focusing on the lapels as well as the cuffs of his greatcoat. Then we're going to use a nice vibrant red that kind of contrasts nicely with the blue that he's wearing in his overcoat. And oddly enough, it has kind of like this regal kind of noble look to him, which kind of makes sense considering that this guy is a rogue trader. Now, you could of course use Mephiston Red, which is used by Games Workshop Citadel line. That costs $4.55. However, I prefer using Anita's acrylic True Red, which is about 8 times less as much cheaper with only 65 cents. It is a beautiful job. I cannot say enough good things about True Red from Anita's acrylic. It's a really awesome product. So I just put 2 thin coats on this for the lapel as well as for the cuffs of the shirt. Now if you're worried about doing any mistakes like getting on the flesh or if the shirt or the jacket, it's not a big deal. You just go back to the regular base coats and just neaten up any mistakes that you might have made, and then from there I'm ready to move on to our next set of details. So the next set of details is primarily the giant fur coat that he's wearing on top of his shoulder as well as his leather goods. So let's go and talk about exactly what that consists of. First of all, we looked at the scabbard as well as the holster and belt that he's wearing across his trousers. Went with a nice dark brown color in order to contrast directly against the skyline as well as the navy blue of his jacket. You could use Wildwood, which is made by Citadel. That's going to cost you $7.80 for that color. But personally, I prefer Apple Barrel's Burnt Umber for 50 cents at my local Walmart. I just put 2 thin coats of that on the holster holster, the scabbard, as well as on the holster that he has and the belt that he's carrying as well in order to create that effect. The next thing we're going to focus on is that giant skinned reptilian furry thing that's resting on his shoulders, which is basically kind of like, I guess, a fur scarf, I guess what you would call that in this case. For the fur on this one, of course, you could use Baylor Brown, which is ran by Citadel, for $4.55, but instead I use Territorial Beige, which costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. And then finally, as for the flesh part of the creature, which is like one of its paws as well as its face as well, you could use Ratkarth Flesh, which is from Citadel, which costs $4.55, or go with a much cheaper alternative, which is an Native's Acrylic Taupe Gray for 65 cents. That's exactly the same exact result, and I just put 2 thin layers of both Territorial Beige as well as Taupe Gray upon the fur, and then from there ready to move on to the additional details on this miniature. And that additional detail we're referring to is on the spines of the creature that's resting on his shoulder as well. Now for that one, I like to use Apple Barrel's Light Mocha. It cost me 50 cents at my local Walmart. I just put 2 thins of that on the spines in order to create kind of like this earthy kind of bone color to those spines as well. Now you could use Baneblade Brown, which is made by Citadel Paint, which is the Citadel equivalent to this, but that stuff costs $4.55 as opposed to 50 cents, which is 9 times cheaper. And once you're done with that detail, we can start moving on to the metallic elements. So the next step, of course, is to work on the metallic elements of this miniature as well. As you can see, I pretty much used 3 major colors in order to achieve that effect on this character. Now, the first one we're going to focus on is all the gold, the silver elements that this guy is wearing. Now, for this, we're using the chest plate that he has, the breastplate he has to protect his chest, as well as the blade of his power sword that he's also carrying. For those colors, you could use Leadbelcher, which is made by Citadel Paint, which costs $7.80, or you could use Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. It's about 10 times cheaper, and it is exactly the same thing. A beautiful dark silver color. I just painted all the parts that want to be silver in 2 thin layers of that. So things like the breastplate, for example, the blade of his power sword, as well as the ocular cybernetic piece that he has in his eye as well. Now from there, the next detail we decided to focus on next was upon the gold elements that this character has as well. Now you could use Retributor Armor, which costs $7.80 from Citadel, or you could use Deco Art's Emperor's Gold, which is exactly the same thing and is also about 10 times cheaper. With that, for those gold elements we picked out were things like the eagle crest that's on his breastplate, the handles of the handle of his dagger, as well as the point of the scabbard. We also use it for the hilt of the power sword that he's also carrying as well. At the same time, the last metallic element we took out are some of the little medals and icons that he has and buttons and things that he has on his long coat. For that, we put that out in 2 thin layers of Nita's Acrylic Aged Antique Copper, which costs 65 cents. You could use Brass Scorpion, but Brass Scorpion costs almost 10 times as much, and so that's the cost difference that we use for those colors. And once you put those 2 layers on the paints, next thing you do now is start working on some little lesser, finer details to finally finish this miniature up. Now the very last thing we're going to work on, of course, are the accent pieces on this miniature, which are basically 2 things. The eye of the cybernetic ocular device that he's wearing, as well as the eyes of the creature on his back, as well as the smoke that's coming out of the pipe that he's currently smoking. So for the smoke for the pipe, we use Dutch Aqua. It's made by Folk Art, costs 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart. You could use Aethermatic Blue from Citadel to achieve exactly the same effect, but that stuff costs $7.80, almost 10 times as much in order to create that same look. As for the eye of the ocular device, as well as the creature that is resting on his shoulder, or dead creature that's resting on his shoulder, I like to use Green Turquoise from Apple Barrel Paint. That stuff costs 50 cents at my local Walmart, as opposed to Pterodon Turquoise from Citadel, which costs $7.80. Now once you put those 2 layers of colors on to create those accent pieces, the next thing we're working on now is on the base. Now for the base on this one, I did make a mistake. I forgot to take a color photo of the actual base coat. I did get a little bit over eager on this part. But the first thing you want to do for the texturing of the base is that you want to paint that in a single layer of pigment paint by Apple Barrel Paint. Now when you put a single layer of this stuff, you will see a lot of the white undercoat from the texturing do peek through the actual pigment paint color, but that's perfectly fine. And the reason why is because we do a dry brush on top of that with successful lighter gray shades of gray. In this case, I use Apple Barrel's pewter paint that we used earlier. Just do a quick dry brush over it. As you can see, it has a beautiful job of creating those highlights on this kind of ashy urban type of texturing. The next color we suggest use next for a dry brush is going to be light gray, pale gray by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. You can also find this in Walmart as well. Real simple colored in order to do that. The other opposing color to this, of course, will be Ulthuan Gray, which costs $4.55, so much more expensive than the regular pale gray from Folk Art. Just do a quick dry brushing on the bases to create this kind of ashy, kind of burnt out look. And now that we're done with that, the base is over with, and the last thing we need to do, of course, is an oil wash. Because this is a quick paint method, a lot of painters like to use Army Painter Strong Tone in order to do this for their oil wash. It's a wonderful product, does exactly what it's advertised to do, but it costs $32 a can in order to use that stuff. Whereas Midwax Polyshade acrylics in Mission Oak will do exactly the same thing, but only cost about 5 times less, costing only $6.99 at your local Hobby Lobby. Now, oil washing does a couple of things. The first thing that oil washing does is that it actually seeps directly into the recesses of the miniatures and brings out a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. Things like folds in the fabric, the individual hairs of the fur of the creature that's riding on his back, the strands of hair, folds in the fabric, all kinds of details that were not available earlier and are now being revealed by the oil wash. The second thing the oil wash does as well is it smooths out the transitions between the dry brushes as well as the base coating that we did in our miniature. So as you can see, that chalky appearance is now gone and it's actually much more smoother appearance overall. And the last thing that the actual oil wash does as well is because it's such a dark color, it mutes down the vibrancy of our colors that we used earlier. That's the reason why I used such bright colors at the beginning of this video to paint up this miniature, because I knew ahead of time that the oil wash is actually going to mute those colors down. Now, when it comes to both Army Painter as well as Polyshade Acrylics by Midwax, both products do have polyurethane, so you do need to let these miniatures dry and cure for about 24 hours. And the reason why is because that polyurethane does need a cure. What it's going to do is create a plastic surface over your miniature. It's going to protect it from weathering as well as fading, which is all kinds of awesome. Now, you do have to wait 24 hours for that stuff to dry and cure, so my suggestion to you is to do this as the very last step of your painting process, and then when you get back to turning on your painting progress the next time, it should be dried and be ready to go. I usually typically paint in the evenings after work, so what I usually do is I make my oil wash at the very last step of that night's painting session, and then I return back to the very next day, and I just continue on from there. Now, this next step, of course, is completely optional, and that is to do a matte varnish on the miniature. Like I said before, we do have a high gloss polyurethane mixed in both products so that you could use that on your miniature. Now, if you like that candy coated sheen on your miniature, then by all means you can skip this next step. However, I do prefer my miniatures to actually be more matte finish, so what I do is I grab a can of Krylon matte varnish spray from my local Walmart. It costs $5.99. I just do one quick over real quick to mute down the vibrancy of that shine on the miniature from the polyurethane. Now, you could, of course, use Miniatorium varnish from Games Workshop, but Citadel's Miniatorium varnish costs $19.55, which is almost 4 times the amount that I would pay for my Krylon matte finish. And the very last step we're going to do, of course, is once again going back to Folk Art Skyline, and we're going to rim the base in 2 layers of Skyline. That grayish blue color is the same exact color I use for almost every single miniature that we use in the Necromunda collection. I just kind of create that kind of city urban vibe with it, and it's a beautiful color to do so. And then once you're done with that, this miniature is pretty much ready to go. So once again, this is the end result that your miniature would look like using our Cheapskate method. As you can see, we have a beautiful tabletop standard, and this guy is ready to rock it down in the Blackstone Fortress, or like in my studio's case, I'm going to primarily use this guy as a character miniature for my Necromunda campaigns and for my battle reports as well. So now that we're done talking about it and showcasing how our Cheapskate method works, let's go and talk about what products that you'll need to purchase from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same effect that we did, except using those name brand products. So this is the shopping list that you'll need to put together from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you wanted to create the same exact effect on your miniatures but using their products instead. So you'll need to get a can of Corax White Spray, which costs $17, followed by the following colors. Pterodon Turquoise for $7.80, Bane Blade Brown, Screamer Pink, both cost $4.55, Wildwood, which costs $7.80, followed up by Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Flayed One Flesh, Benrigian Gray, Mephiston Red, and Rakarth Flesh, and all of those colors will run you $4.55 per pot. After that, for your metallics, you'll need Brass Scorpion as well as Lead Belcher. Both those metallic paints cost $7.80. You also need to buy a pot of Rust Gray for $4.55, Aethermatic Blue for $7.80, McCrag Blue for $4.55, as well as Retributor Armor for $7.80. And if you decide to use a quick paint method using Army Painter Strong Tone, you got to spend another $32 in order to get that product. And if you want to put a varnish on your miniature as well, you'll need to buy a can of Minotaurian varnish for $19.50. And of course, for the texturing on this, you'll need to buy Astrogranite, which runs you for $7.80 for that texture paste. Now, assuming that you're purchasing all of your Citadel and Army Painter supplies in order to paint your miniatures exactly the same way we did, you're talking about a grand total investment of $169.90 to paint up your miniature the same way we did using our Cheapskate method, but using Citadel as well as Army Painter. Now, our Cheapskate method only costs us $28.47 with everything that we used. When you subtract the two, you're talking about a grand total savings of $141.43 that you can save use on other miniatures, or whatever you want to do with it. It's up to you. It's entirely your decision what you want to do with that. But there you guys have it. That's exactly the shopping list that you'll need to get from Citadel in order to do exactly the same thing we did, only we saved you $141.43 in the process. So there you guys have it. This is how you guys can quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up Warhammer Quest's Blackstone Fortress's Janus Draik very cheaply as well as very quickly. And that's good news for you guys. So as always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blog.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good news for you guys. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.